The church bells tolled like a warning, their echoes chasing Caleb through the dusty streets of Willow Creek, Nebraska. At 17, he'd spent years kneeling in pews, begging God to rip out the part of him that loved boys. Tonight, he ran from the sermon that branded him a sinner, his heart pounding with a truth he couldn't bury. Caleb's sneakers slapped against the cracked pavement, the summer air thick with the scent of cut grass and guilt. Willow Creek was a town of rigid lines, white picket fences, Bible verses on billboards, and secrets locked tight behind closed doors. He'd grown up in its shadow, the preacher's son, expected to embody purity. But purity didn't feel like stolen glances at Jesse Harper in math class, or the way his pulse raced when Jesse's hand brushed his during a pickup basketball game. Purity felt like a cage. He slowed at the edge of town, where the cornfields stretched toward the horizon like a sea of whispers. His mother, Ruth, had always called this spot God's canvas, where she'd pray for guidance. Caleb hadn't prayed here in years, not since he realized his prayers for fixing himself were met with silence. He dropped to his knees, the earth cool beneath him, and let the weight of the night press against his chest. "Why me?" he whispered, his voice cracking. The stars above offered no answer, but the ache in his heart did. He was tired of hiding. Ruth had noticed the change in her son long before he spoke it aloud. She'd seen the way his shoulders slumped after church, the way his eyes darted away when she asked about his day. At 45, Ruth was a pillar of Willow Creek's First Baptist Church, her alto voice leading hymns every Sunday. But her faith, once unyielding, had begun to crack under the weight of her son's pain. She'd spent years praying for Caleb to be healed. But lately, her prayers had shifted. She didn't ask for miracles anymore, she asked for understanding. That night, as Caleb knelt in the cornfield, Ruth sat at her kitchen table, a letter half written in her careful script. Her cancer had returned, fiercer this time, and the doctors gave her months, not years. She'd kept it from Caleb, not wanting to burden him, but the words she wrote now were for him. "My dearest Caleb," she began, her pen trembling. "You are not broken. You are my answered prayer." She paused, tears blurring the ink. She'd spent years teaching him to fear his heart. But now, with time slipping away, she wanted him to embrace it. Caleb didn't know about the letter. He didn't know his mother was dying. All he knew was the pull of Jesse Harper, the boy who'd moved to Willow Creek 2 years ago with a leather jacket and a smile that cut through Caleb's defenses. Jesse was everything Caleb wasn't hoping. Fearless, unapologetic. He'd come out at school last year, enduring the whispers and shoves with a defiance Caleb envied. They'd grown close, sharing late-night talks by the creek. But Caleb always pulled back, terrified of what it meant to want more. The next morning, Caleb found Jesse at their usual spot by the creek, skipping stones across the water. The sunlight caught Jesse's dark hair, and Caleb's breath hitched. "You okay?" Jesse asked, his voice soft but probing. Caleb nodded, but his eyes betrayed him, heavy with the weight of last night's sermon. Jesse stepped closer, his hand grazing Caleb's arm. "You don't have to keep running. You know," he said. "Not for me." Caleb froze, the words slicing through years of shame. He wanted to tell Jesse everything, how he'd prayed to be different, how he feared his father's wrath, how he dreamed of a life where he could hold Jesse's hand in public. But the words caught in his throat, tangled with fear. Instead, he pulled away, muttering an excuse about chores, and fled back to the safety of silence. At home, Ruth watched her son from the kitchen window, her heart aching. She'd seen the way Caleb looked at Jesse, the same way she'd once looked at her husband, David, before life hardened him into the unyielding pastor he'd become. David's sermons had grown harsher lately, railing against sins of the flesh with a fervor that left Ruth uneasy. She knew he loved Caleb, but his love came with conditions Caleb could never meet. That evening, David called a family meeting. His voice was stern as he announced a church retreat, a renewal for the youth to cleanse their hearts. Caleb's stomach churned. He knew what this meant: more prayers, more guilt, more attempts to fix him. Ruth's hand found his under the table, squeezing gently, but her eyes were distant, clouded with something Caleb couldn't name. As the days passed, Caleb felt the walls closing in. The retreat loomed like a storm cloud, and Jesse's presence became both a lifeline and a danger. They met in secret, sharing stolen moments in the cornfields or behind the old barn. Each touch, each whispered confession, felt like a rebellion against the town, the church, and the God Caleb wasn't sure he believed in anymore. But with every moment, the fear grew: fear of being caught, fear of losing Jesse, fear of losing himself. Ruth, meanwhile, poured her heart into her letter. She wrote of her regrets, her love, her hope that Caleb would find peace. She wrote of a God who didn't demand perfection, but celebrated love in all its forms. She hid the letter in her Bible, intending to give it to Caleb when the time was right. But time, she knew, was running out. By the end of the week, Caleb stood at a crossroads. The retreat was tomorrow, and with it, the weight of his father's expectations. Jesse had asked him to run away together, to leave Willow Creek and start fresh somewhere new. The idea was intoxicating, but it meant abandoning his mother, his home, everything he'd ever known. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he wondered if he could ever be brave enough to choose himself. The retreat was held at Camp Grace, a sprawling lakeside compound an hour from Willow Creek, where pine trees whispered secrets and the air carried the weight of judgment. Caleb sat in the back of the church van, his knees pressed against the seat in front of him, his mind racing with Jesse's words: "We could leave. Caleb, just you and me." The idea felt like a lifeline, but it also terrified him. Leaving meant burning every bridge he'd ever crossed. The camp was a blur of sermons and group prayers, each session hammering the same message: sin could be overcome with faith. Caleb's father, David, led the charge, his voice booming with conviction as he spoke of resisting temptation. Caleb's eyes stayed glued to the floor, but he felt the weight of every word, each one a stone piling onto his chest. The other teens whispered about him, their glances sharp with suspicion. Word had spread about his friendship with Jesse, and in a town like Willow Creek, rumors were as good as truth. During a break, Caleb slipped away to the lake, its surface glinting like a mirror under the midday sun. He tossed pebbles into the water, watching the ripples spread and fade. Jesse's face kept flashing in his mind: those hazel eyes, that crooked smile, the way he made Caleb feel seen. But every thought of Jesse was shadowed by his father's voice, by the sermons that called his feelings an abomination. Caleb's fists clenched, torn between love and shame. Back in Willow Creek, Ruth sat in her oncologist's office, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The news was grim. The cancer had spread, and treatment options were dwindling. She nodded, her face calm. But inside, her heart screamed. She didn't fear death, not really, but she feared leaving Caleb in a world that might break him. She'd seen the light in his eyes when he talked about Jesse, and she'd seen it dim under David's relentless preaching. That night, she added to her letter, "Caleb, your heart is not a sin. It's a gift. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." At the retreat, Caleb's resolve began to crack. During a late-night prayer circle, the youth pastor called him forward, his voice dripping with pity. "God can heal you, Caleb," he said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You just have to want it." The room went silent, all eyes on him. Caleb's throat tightened, his pulse hammering. He wanted to scream that he'd tried, that he'd begged God to change him. But nothing had worked. Instead, he nodded, the lie burning his tongue, and stumbled back to his bunk. That night, he dreamed of Jesse. They were running through the cornfields, laughing, free, the world soft and golden around them. But the dream shifted, and Jesse's face became his father's, his voice thundering with scripture. Caleb woke gasping, his shirt damp with sweat. He couldn't do this anymore, not the hiding, not the praying, not the pretending. He needed to see Jesse. He snuck out at dawn, borrowing a bike from the camp and pedaling back to Willow Creek. The ride was grueling, the summer heat pressing against him, but desperation fueled every mile. He found Jesse at the creek, sitting on a fallen log, his expression a mix of worry and relief. "You came back," Jesse said, standing. Caleb didn't think, closed the distance between them and kissed him, fierce and trembling, the world falling away. For a moment, it was perfect. Jesse's hands cupped his face, their breaths mingling, the creek murmuring its approval. But the sound of tires crunching on gravel snapped them apart. A truck pulled up, and Caleb's heart sank as his father stepped out, his face a mask of fury. "Get in the truck, Caleb," David said, his voice low and dangerous. Jesse stepped forward, but Caleb shook his head, his eyes pleading. He climbed into the truck, his chest hollow, as Jesse's figure grew smaller in the rearview mirror. David didn't speak on the drive home. The silence was worse than any sermon, heavy with disappointment and rage. When they reached the house, David turned to him, his eyes cold. "You will not shame this family," he said. "You will not see that boy again." Caleb wanted to argue, to scream that he loved Jesse, but the words wouldn't come. He nodded, his throat burning, and slipped into the house. Ruth was waiting in the kitchen, her face pale but resolute. She'd heard the truck, seen the look in David's eyes. She pulled Caleb into a hug, whispering, "You're enough, just as you are." Her words were a lifeline, but Caleb couldn't shake the fear that he was losing everything. He didn't know about the letter, didn't know his mother was fighting for him in ways he couldn't see. All he knew was the ache in his chest and the memory of Jesse's kiss. That night, Caleb lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The retreat had failed to fix him, and his father's anger only deepened his resolve. He couldn't live like Thishelf hidden, half alive. But leaving meant breaking his mother's heart, and he wasn't sure he was strong enough for that. As dawn broke, he made a decision, He would talk to Jesse one last time, no matter the cost. The air in Willow Creek felt heavier now, as if the town itself knew Caleb's secret and disapproved. He slipped out before sunrise, his heart pounding as he biked to the old barn where he and Jesse often met. The barn was weathered, its red paint peeling, but it was their sanctuary, a place where the world's rules didn't apply. Jesse was already there, leaning against a hay bale, his eyes searching Caleb's face. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft but urgent. Caleb shook his head, the weight of his father's words still crushing him. "He knows. Jesse. About us." The confession hung between them, sharp and dangerous. Jesse's jaw tightened, but he stepped closer, his hand finding Caleb's. "Then we leave," he said. "We go somewhere they can't touch us." Caleb wanted to believe it was that simple, but the thought of abandoning his mother, his home, his entire life, felt like tearing out a piece of himself. They sat in the barn for hours, talking in hushed tones. Jesse spoke of cities where they could be free: San Francisco, New York, places where love didn't have to hide. Caleb listened, his heart torn between hope and fear. He told Jesse about the retreat, the prayers, the way his father's eyes had burned with shame. Jesse's hand tightened around his, grounding him. "You're not what they say you are," Jesse whispered. "You're more." Back at home, Ruth sensed the storm brewing. She'd overheard David's plans to send Caleb to a conversion camp, a place rumored to cure kids like him. Her blood ran cold at the thought. She'd spent years trusting the church's teachings. But now, faced with her son's pain, she saw them for what they were: chains. She added to her letter, her words fierce with conviction, "Caleb, God made you exactly as you are. Don't let them steal your light." That afternoon, Caleb returned home to find his father waiting. David's face was a mask of control, but his voice trembled with anger. "I've enrolled you in a program," he said. "It'll help you." Caleb's stomach dropped. He'd heard whispers of conversion camp stories of kids broken by shame, their spirits crushed under the guise of salvation. "No," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop it. David's eyes widened, but Caleb stood his ground. "I'm not going." The argument that followed shook the house. David's voice rose, quoting scripture, while Caleb's shook with defiance. Ruth stepped in, her frail frame a quiet force between them. "Enough," she said, her voice steady despite her weakening body. "David, he's our son." But David stormed out, leaving a silence that felt like a wound. Ruth pulled Caleb close, her hands trembling. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. But Caleb saw the fear in her eyes, fear for him, for them, for what came next. That night, Caleb snuck out again, meeting Jesse at the creek. The moon hung low, casting silver across the water. Jesse's plan was clearer now. They'd save money, catch a bus to Chicago, start over. But Caleb hesitated, thinking of his mother's tired smile, her gentle hands. "She's all I have," he told Jesse, his voice breaking. Jesse nodded, his eyes soft with understanding. "Then we wait," he said. "But not forever." The next day, Caleb found a note from his mother, tucked into his jacket pocket. It wasn't the letter she wasn't ready to share that yet, but a simple message: "You are enough." The words burned into him, a spark of courage in the darkness. He decided to confront his father again, to make him see. But when he approached David in the church office, he found him reading a pamphlet about the conversion camp, his face set in determination. Caleb's heart sank. This wasn't a father who would listen. As the week unfolded, Caleb and Jesse grew bolder, meeting in secret, their moments together a rebellion against the town's judgment. But Willow Creek was small, and eyes were everywhere. A neighbor saw them by the creek, their hands brushing, and word spread like wildfire. By Sunday, the church was buzzing with whispers, and David's sermon took a darker turn, his words aimed at those who stray. Caleb sat in the pew, his face burning, knowing every eye was on him. Ruth watched from the choir loft, her heart breaking. She knew she had to act, to protect her son before it was too late. She slipped away during the sermon, her steps unsteady but determined, and returned to her letter. She poured everything into Ither love, her regrets, her hope for Caleb's future. She sealed it, tucking it into her Bible, and prayed she'd have the chance to give it to him. Caleb, meanwhile, felt the walls closing in. The town, the church, his father all seemed determined to crush him. But Jesse's voice echoed in his mind, "You're more." He wasn't sure he believed it, but he wanted to. As he left church that day, he made a choice. He would fight for himself, for Jesse, for the life they could have. But he didn't know how high the cost would be. The whispers in Willow Creek grew louder, a chorus of judgment that followed Caleb like a shadow. He felt it in the grocery store, where Mrs. Larson's eyes lingered too long, and at school, where kids he'd known since kindergarten turned away. Jesse, unfazed by the gossip, urged Caleb to ignore it. "They don't get to decide who you are," he said, his voice fierce. But Caleb wasn't Jesse. He wasn't built to shrug off the weight of a town's disapproval. At home, the tension was suffocating. David barely spoke to Caleb, his silence a punishment sharper than words. Ruth tried to bridge the gap, her gentle questions met with David's curt replies. Caleb noticed her growing frailty, her pale skin, the way she leaned on the counter for support, but she waved off his concerns, insisting she was fine. He didn't know about the cancer, didn't know she was counting her days. One evening, Caleb overheard his parents arguing. David's voice was low, insistent. He needs to be fixed. Ruth. For his soul. Ruth's reply was sharp, a tone Caleb rarely heard. His soul is not the problem. Your fear is. Caleb stood frozen outside their bedroom door, his heart pounding. His mother was fighting for him. But at what cost? He retreated to his room, guilt gnawing at him. He wanted to tell her about Jesse, about the love that felt like salvation. But fear kept him silent. Jesse, meanwhile, was making plans. He'd saved enough from his part-time job at the diner to buy 2 bus tickets to Chicago. "We can crash with my cousin there," he told Caleb during a late-night meeting in the barn. "He's cool. Won't judge." Caleb's heart raced at the thought of a new city, a new life, but the image of his mother's tired smile anchored him. "I can't leave her," he said, his voice breaking. Jesse's eyes softened, but there was a flicker of frustration. "You can't stay here forever, Caleb. It's killing you." The next day, Caleb found a moment alone with Ruth. They sat on the porch, the evening air cool against their skin. Mom. He started, his voice trembling. I'm gay. The words felt like a confession and a release. Heavy and light all at once. Ruth's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled, pulling him into a hug. I know, sweetheart, she whispered. And I love you. For the first time in years, Caleb felt like he could breathe. But the relief was short-lived. That night, David found a text from Jesse on Caleb's phone. A simple "I miss you" that set off a storm. This ends now, David roared, his face red with rage. He grounded Caleb, forbidding him from leaving the house except for church. Caleb's defiance slipped out anyway, meeting Jesse at the creek. They kissed under the stars, desperate and fierce. But the sound of footsteps sent them scrambling. It was only a deer, but the scare was a reminder they weren't safe. Ruth, meanwhile, was weakening. The cancer was relentless, and she struggled to hide it. She spent hours revising her letter, her words a testament to her love for Caleb. You are my miracle, she wrote. Live your truth, no matter what. She planned to give it to him soon, but she wanted one last moment of strength, one last chance to see him smile. At school, the rumors reached a fever pitch. A group of boys cornered Caleb in the locker room, their taunts cutting deep. Freak, one spat, shoving him against a locker. Caleb didn't fight back, learned long ago that fighting only made it worse. But when Jesse heard, he was furious, ready to confront them. Caleb begged him to let it go, terrified of escalating things further. I can't lose you, he said, his voice raw. Jesse relented, but the fire in his eyes didn't fade. By the end of the week, Caleb felt like he was drowning. His father's control, the town's judgment, his mother's unspoken pine, it was too much. He and Jesse made a plan, 1 month to save enough money. Then they'd leave. But that night, Caleb came home to find Ruth collapsed on the kitchen floor, her breathing shallow. Panic seized him as he called 911, his hands shaking. As the ambulance lights flashed outside, he realized the truth. His mother was dying, and he might not have time to say goodbye. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and fear, a sterile maze where Caleb felt smaller than ever. Ruth lay in a bed, tubes snaking from her arms, her face pale but peaceful. The doctor's words echoed in Caleb's mind. Weeks, maybe days. He sat by her side, holding her hand, his heart a tangle of grief and guilt. He hadn't known she was this sick, hadn't seen the signs. Why didn't you tell me? He whispered, his voice breaking. Ruth squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with love. I wanted you to live, Caleb, she said. Not worry. She told him about the cancer, her voice steady despite the pain. She spoke of her pride in him, her regret for the years she'd let the church's teachings hurt him. You're perfect, she said, tears falling. Don't ever doubt that. Caleb sobbed, the weight of her words both a comfort and a wound. David was there too, but he kept his distance, his face unreadable. Caleb saw the conflict in his eyes, love for Ruth, anger at Caleb, fear of losing them both. When the doctor mentioned palliative care, David's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, Caleb saw his father as a man, not a preacher. But the chasm between them felt too wide to cross. Jesse came to the hospital, sneaking in after visiting hours. He found Caleb in the waiting room, his eyes red from crying. Without a word, Jesse pulled him into a hug, holding him as the world fell apart. "I'm here," Jesse whispered, and Caleb clung to him, the only anchor in the storm. They talked in hushed tones, Jesse promising to stay no matter what. But Caleb's heart was torn. His mother needed him. But so did Jesse, and he couldn't choose. Back in Willow Creek, the town buzzed with news of Ruth's illness. Sympathy cards arrived, but so did whispers about Caleb, the preacher's son who'd gone astray. David's sermons grew quieter, his fire dimmed by grief. But he still refused to speak to Caleb about Jesse. The conversion camp pamphlet sat on his desk, a silent threat. Ruth, in her hospital bed, gave Caleb her Bible one evening, her hands trembling. "Read it when you're ready," she said, her voice faint. Inside was the letter, but Caleb didn't open it, not yet. He couldn't bear the thought of her goodbye. Instead, he spent hours by her side, telling her about Jesse, about their dreams of Chicago. Ruth listened, her smile soft, and for the first time, Caleb felt truly seen. But the hospital wasn't a sanctuary. A nurse, a member of their church, overheard Caleb talking about Jesse and reported it to David. That night, David confronted Caleb in the hospital cafeteria, his voice low but fierce. "You're breaking her heart," he said, gesturing toward Ruth's room. Caleb's anger flared. "You're breaking mine," he shot back, the words spilling out. For a moment, David looked struck, but he turned away, leaving Caleb alone with his pain. Jesse urged Caleb to focus on Ruth, to be with her while he could. They stole moments together in the hospital garden, their hands brushing under the cover of night. But the weight of Ruth's illness and David's disapproval pressed harder each day. Caleb began to wonder if love was worth this pain, if he could ever be enough for anyone. One night, Ruth's condition worsened. The doctors warned it could be hours. Caleb stayed by her side, reading from her favorite psalms, his voice shaking. She reached for his hand, her grip weak but certain. "Live for you," she whispered, her eyes locking onto his. "Promise me." Caleb nodded, tears streaming down his face. But the promise felt impossible. As dawn broke, Ruth slipped away, her hand still in Caleb's. The world went quiet, the loss of physical ache in his chest. He didn't know about the letter waiting in her Bible, didn't know the words that would change everything. All he knew was that his mother was gone, and he was alone with a father who couldn't accept him in a town that never would. The funeral was held at First Baptist, the church packed with mourners in black, their faces a blur to Caleb. He stood at the front, his father's hand heavy on his shoulder, a gesture that felt more like control than comfort. The congregation sang Ruth's favorite hymn, but Caleb couldn't join in. His voice was trapped in his throat, choked by grief. He kept seeing his mother's smile, her final words, "Live for you." They echoed like a challenge he wasn't sure he could meet. Jesse sat in the back, his presence a quiet rebellion against the town's judgment. Caleb caught his eye during the service, and for a moment, the world felt bearable. But David's sermon, laced with calls for redemption, reminded Caleb of the chasm between them. After the service, people offered condolences, their words kind but hollow. Caleb wanted to scream that they didn't know his mother, not the woman who'd loved him despite everything. That night, alone in his room, Caleb opened Ruth's Bible. The letter fell out, her handwriting a lifeline in the dark. He read it, his breath hitching with every word. "You are not broken," she wrote. "You are my answered prayer. Caleb, God made you to love, and that love is holy." She spoke of her regrets, her journey from fear to acceptance, her hope that he'd find peace. "Don't let them dim your light," she urged. "Live boldly, my son." Caleb clutched the letter, sobbing, her love a weight and a gift. The letter changed everything. It was as if Ruth had reached through time to hold him, to tell him he was enough. But it also sharpened his pain. She was gone, and he hadn't had the chance to thank her, to tell her how much her acceptance meant. He slipped out to meet Jesse, the letter tucked in his pocket. They sat by the creek, the water reflecting the stars, and Caleb read the letter aloud, his voice breaking. Jesse listened, his hand steady on Caleb's back. "She saw you," he said. "She loved you." But Willow Creek wasn't done with Caleb. The next day, David called him into the church office. The conversion camp pamphlet was gone, replaced by a bus to Kedo, a facility in Kansas. "You leave tomorrow," David said, his voice flat. Caleb's anger surged. "She wouldn't have wanted this," he said, holding up the letter. David's face hardened. "She was sick, Caleb." She didn't know what she was saying. The words cut deeper than any sermon. And Caleb stormed out, the letter burning in his hand. He found Jesse at the diner, his shift just ending. "I'm done," Caleb said, his voice fierce. "I'm leaving." "With you?" Jesse's eyes lit up. But there was caution there too. "Your dad won't let you go easy," he said. Caleb knew he was right. But Ruth's words echoed, live boldly. He wasn't running away, he was running toward himself. They planned in secret, pooling their money for bus tickets to Chicago. But that night, David found Caleb packing a bag. The argument was explosive, years of pain spilling out. "You're choosing sin over family," David shouted. Caleb's voice shook but didn't break. "I'm choosing me." He left the house, the letter in his pocket, and met Jesse at the barn. They stayed there until dawn, holding each other, the world quiet for the first time in weeks. But freedom wasn't simple. As they prepared to leave, Caleb heard rumors of David rallying the church to save him. The town's judgment felt like a noose, tightening with every step. Jesse's cousin in Chicago was ready to take them in, but the journey felt daunting, a leap into the unknown. Caleb clung to his mother's letter, her words a beacon, "You are my answered prayer." He wasn't sure he believed in God anymore, but he believed in her. As they boarded the bus at dawn, Caleb looked back at Willow Creek, its steeples and cornfields fading in the morning light. He felt the weight of his mother's love, the sting of his father's rejection, and the warmth of Jesse's hand in his. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, Caleb felt like he was moving toward something real. The bus to Chicago rumbled through the night, its engine a steady hum beneath Caleb's racing thoughts. He sat beside Jesse, their hands intertwined under a folded jacket, hidden from the other passengers. Ruth's letter was tucked in Caleb's backpack, its words a shield against the fear gnawing at him. He'd left Willow Creek behind, but the town's shadow lingered, his father's voice, the church's judgment, the weight of a life he'd never fit into. Chicago was a shock of noise and light. skyscrapers looming like giants against the dawn. Jesse's cousin, Marcus, met them at the station. His easy smile a stark contrast to Willow Creek's pinched faces. "Welcome to freedom," Marcus said, pulling them into a hug. His apartment was small but warm, filled with music and color. A world where Caleb and Jesse could hold hands without looking over their shoulders. For the first time, Caleb felt a flicker of hope. But freedom came with challenges. Caleb and Jesse found part-time jobs, Jesse at a coffee shop, Caleb at a bookstore, but money was tight. And the city's pace was relentless. Caleb struggled with the guilt of leaving his father. Even after everything, he wrote letters to David, short notes begging for understanding. But they went unanswered. Ruth's letter, read and reread until the creases wore thin, kept him grounded. "You are my answered prayer," she'd written, and Caleb clung to that truth. Jesse was his anchor, his laughter a balm for Caleb's wounds. They explored the city together, stealing kisses in alleyways, dancing at a pride event where rainbows painted the streets. But Caleb's grief was a quiet companion, surfacing in moments of silence. He missed his mother's voice, her gentle touch, the way she'd made him feel safe. Jesse noticed, pulling him close during those dark moments. "She's with you," he'd say, and Caleb would nod, wanting to believe it. Back in Willow Creek, David wrestled with his own demons. Ruth's death had cracked something in him. Her letter to Caleb a challenge he couldn't ignore. He read it one night, alone in the church. Her words cutting through his certainty. God made him to love. David's faith had always been his compass, but now it felt like a map with no destination. He didn't write to Caleb, didn't call, but he stopped preaching about sin. His sermons softer, searching. Caleb, meanwhile, found a community in Chicago. Marcus introduced them to a local LGBT center, where Caleb met others who'd fled small towns, their stories echoing his own. He joined a support group, sharing his pain for the first time. The facilitator, a kind woman named Lena, told him, "Your mother's love gave you wings. Use them." Caleb began to see his journey not as escape, but as rebirth. But the past wasn't done with him. One day, a letter arrived from Willow Creek, not from David, but from Mrs. Larson, the grocery store clerk. She'd found Ruth's old journal while cleaning the church, filled with notes about Caleb, her pride in him, her prayers for his happiness. "Your mother was your biggest champion," she wrote. "Don't let this town define you." The letter was a gift, a reminder of Ruth's fierce love, but it also stirred old wounds. Caleb and Jesse's relationship deepened, but it wasn't without strain. The stress of the city, the weight of their pasts, led to arguments small at first, then sharper. One night, Caleb snapped, afraid Jesse would tire of his grief. "I'm not her," Jesse said, his voice breaking. "But I'm here." They made up, their love stronger for it. But Caleb realized he had to heal for himself, not just for Jesse. As winter settled over Chicago, Caleb began writing stories, poems, fragments of his life in Willow Creek. He wrote about his mother, her letter, the boy he'd been and the man he was becoming. The words were a release, a way to make sense of the pain. He shared them with Jesse, who read them with tears in his eyes. "You're telling her story too," Jesse said, and Caleb realized he was right. By spring, Caleb felt the stirrings of peace. He wasn't fixed, didn't need to be. He was enough, just as Ruth had said. But the question of his father lingered, a loose thread in his new life. He wasn't sure if he could forgive David, or if David could ever accept him. But he knew he had to try, not for his father, but for himself. Spring in Chicago bloomed with possibility. The city's parks bursting with color, mirroring the shift in Caleb's heart. He and Jesse had carved out a life together. Their small apartment, a haven of laughter and love. Caleb's job at the bookstore became a passion, found solace in the stories. Each one a reminder that he wasn't alone. Ruth's letter, now framed on their wall, was a daily reminder, you are my answered prayer. But the shadow of Willow Creek and his father still lingered. Caleb's writing grew bolder. His stories shared at open mics, earning quiet applause from strangers who saw themselves in his words. Jesse was his biggest supporter, his pride a light in Caleb's darker moments. But the question of David gnawed at him. Caleb hadn't heard from his father in months, and the silence felt like a wound that wouldn't heal. He wanted closure, not reconciliation. Wasn't sure that was possible. One evening, Lena from the support group suggested Caleb write to David. Not to beg, but to speak his truth. You don't need his approval, she said, but you deserve to be heard. Caleb spent days drafting the letter, pouring out his pain, his love for Jesse, his gratitude for Ruth. I'm not broken, he wrote, echoing his mother's words. I'm living the life she wanted for me. He mailed it, his hands trembling, unsure if he'd get a reply. Back in Willow Creek, David had changed. Ruth's death and Caleb's absence had forced him to confront his beliefs. He'd stopped preaching altogether, his sermons replaced by guest pastors. He spent hours in the church, reading Ruth's journal, her letter to Caleb, her notes about love and grace. For the first time, he questioned the scriptures he'd wielded like weapons. When Caleb's letter arrived, David read it alone, tears falling. His son's words were a mirror, reflecting his failures as a father. David wrote back, a single page, his handwriting unsteady. I was wrong. He began. I don't understand your life, but I want to try. He didn't ask for forgiveness, knew he hadn't earned it, but he asked to see Caleb, to talk. Caleb read the letter with Jesse, his heart a storm of hope and fear. You don't owe him anything, Jesse said. But Caleb knew he needed this. Not for David, but for himself. They met in a Chicago cafe, the air thick with tension. David looked older, his eyes heavy with regret. Caleb sat across from him, Ruth's letter in his pocket for strength. They talked for hours about Ruth, about faith, about the years of pain. David didn't apologize outright, but his questions were gentle, his listening earnest. I loved her too, he said, his voice breaking. I just didn't know how to love you. Caleb nodded, the words a small bridge across a vast divide. It wasn't reconciliation, not fully, but it was a start. Caleb returned to Jesse, lighter, as if a weight had lifted. He realized he didn't need David's approval, had his mother's, and his own. That night, he and Jesse walked through the city, the skyline glittering like a promise. They stopped at a bridge, the water below reflecting the stars, and Caleb felt a peace he hadn't known was possible. Months later, Caleb published a story in a local magazine, dedicated to Ruth. It was about a boy who found himself in a world that tried to break him, and a mother whose love was his salvation. The final line read, "He was her answered prayer, and she was his." Readers wrote to him, sharing their own stories, and Caleb felt his mother's light shining through him. Caleb and Jesse's life wasn't perfect. Money was still tight. Arguments still flared, but it was theirs. They built a community, a family of chosen hearts. And Caleb knew he'd found his place. Willow Creek was a memory, a scar that faded with time. David visited once more, bringing Ruth's old hymn book, a quiet gesture of peace. They didn't talk about the past, but they sang together, their voices blending in a way they never had before. As summer returned, Caleb stood at a pride parade, Jesse's hand in his, rainbows waving around them. He thought of his mother, her letter, her love that had carried him here. He wasn't fixed, said was whole. And in that moment, under a sky bursting with color, Caleb knew he was living the life she'd prayed for, bold, true, and his own.